Hi, welcome back to Nora's Neighbors, an hour of interesting conversation with interesting people from in and around Westchester. Maybe you're listening to us on WVOX AM, or maybe you're on .com, WVOX.com, or maybe you've managed to get to the newest part of life and you're listening to us in WVIP HD2. Whatever, we're glad you're here for the conversation with the people from the Pelham Art Center. Elizabeth Saperstein, who is the curator of the Things Themselves, an exhibit that opens tomorrow night with a reception at 6:30?
Yes, our opening reception for the public is at 6:30 to 8 p.m.
And you'll have an art project, an all-age art project, which
do.
you always do with
We
your
always do at all of our openings. We have a instructor in our studio, and anyone's welcome to go into the studio, and in this case, they will make a project somehow relating to still life artwork. Yeah.
And with Elizabeth and me are two of the artists whose works are in tomorrow night's show, Kevin Klein and Scott Seaboldt, and we've been talking about what still life is, and during the break, Scott said, the elephant in the room is that still life is boring because I began the show by saying it's vases and fruit. But you've been saying that's really not what it is, that it's taking everyday objects or objects that are familiar and seeing them through the eyes of an artist, which is not ho-hum if it's done well. Am I right? Is that what everybody was saying to me in my art appreciation? Because the silence is overwhelming.
Yes, that is what that is what we were saying.
I thought what was interesting is, again, during the break that Elizabeth was saying was that there was an artist or something about consumer culture, and that because if your listeners have ever taken an art course, they almost always start out in some fashion with a bowl and a vase, whether it's drawing or painting or anything, because it's just to teach you the media. It's just to get used to the art experience of drawing or painting or whatever it is. So it's open, and a lot of artists will take something that's open like that, and sometimes, you can't use the figure sometimes because the figure automatically is laden with sexuality, and it's male or female, it's white or it's black, or it's of skin of color or whatever it is. It's already got things, oftentimes with things on a table, a fork and a knife and a spoon on a plate. It already starts to bespeak things like hunger, or you can already start to bring in issues. So I think the artist likes sometimes just to be able to come into the studio and work and just get going and not have to suddenly bring an agenda upon agenda, or has a lot of things. So trying to get your hands dirty to begin with, start thinking visually. And so a lot of times the still life, the objects themselves become a point of departure, and as opposed to having to do everything at once, come up with a really something super visually exciting and something that's very topical at the same time. Sometimes taking a very mundane thing and being able to speak volumes through it is possibly, this is something that doesn't often said around still life, but it's often heroic. It's something that you can do something with the mundane, often like the small poem. I'm a fan of poetry, the haiku, the small, I'm going to forget her name. She's our poet laureate now. Kay Ryan. She's a wonderful poet. She's leaving W.S. Merwin's coming in. And she's just lovely. She has these small poems, but she sends volumes through it. And a lot of times the Baroque, the large, the huge, the magnanimous artworks, shiny, that really draw your attention, you can't get away from them, are the ones that we often are drawn to in museums, where the overlooked, well-known book called Looking at the Overlooked is the still life. And so for the artist, they kind of like to, it's comfortable too. If people overlook it, you're not at risk too. If you make something that cost you a few thousand to make, you put a lot out there. So
what you're saying, are you saying that like still life is a really nice genre to work in, because you can go in and on the one hand you can just deal with the stuff formally, you can make the apple and the orange and the bottle and things like that, and if you want to think about it differently, think about it conceptually, you can start to think about what could they mean, what could they symbolize, so they could symbolize things or they could not symbolize things.
Yeah, that's always been my hang up in the studio, is like, what am I going to say? I'm like, what? I don't really have anything to say. I've like hard enough going to the voting booth, it's like, what are you going to do, And so I found that through that manner of approaching the studio, materially based and going into a still life a little bit, and abstract art often can be that way. Abstract designs and things like this can also be as empty and devoid of import of some kind of heroic thing to say. So Kevin, I was just kind of alluding to the fact that you can bring it on if you want to, but it's not necessary.
Which leads me, and this is the English major coming out. Doesn't an artist always have something he or she wants to say? I mean, certainly writers, poets, you expect that they're using words. And I guess I always assumed whether you were a portrait painter, Kevin, you mentioned Hans Holbein before, or you were a still life painter or whatever you painted, you were really using that to express something you felt, believed, whatever. Isn't that true?
I think when you're working with images as opposed to working with words, just the physical process of making the image, even if it's a photograph, and there's a lot of darkroom work, or if you're painting, of course, it's a very slow process just to construct the image. I think with words, you can sort of get through, you just keep hitting the keys and they keep coming out, and I'm sure it's harder than that, but I know it's harder than that.
And you work with symbols and, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but I think that the formal quality of it, in making visual art, is just more time-consuming and labor-intensive, and sometimes so we end up dwelling on the form maybe a lot more. But I think we all have things to say. Sometimes you decide I'm going to say X in a painting. You try to put it in, or you say I'm going to say X, Y, Z, and A, B, and C. And sometimes when you're trying to pack too many things in, you get an agenda and you're sort of shoving them in there. It doesn't come across. Sometimes you think you're trying to say something when, in fact, something else is trying to leak out of your subconscious. And I think sometimes, that's one way I'll work, or other people will work. You just sort of come up with a bunch of, put a few things out there and paint them and draw, and then see after you've done it what were you doing? What thing were you suggesting unconsciously? And then maybe you go back and maybe more consciously pursue that meaning.
We're going to take a break for some news and announcements. We'll be back with Nora's Neighbors after this break. I wasn't looking at the conversation today is revolving around art, specifically an exhibit that's opening tomorrow night, The Things Themselves, at the Pelham Art Center. And with me are Elizabeth Saperstein, who curated the show, and two of the artists whose work appear in the show, Kevin Klein and Scott Seaboldt. And we've gone off the whole idea of what still art is and how it fits, and we got into artists and messages. And Elizabeth, when we took the break, was in the middle of talking about a piece, and I want to let her finish her idea.
Oh, okay. I mean, generally, we were talking about. You asked us if the artists have a message, and if the artists have a message, and I think that it just depends. I mean, from a curatorial standpoint, we looked at a particular work I was describing. It's called Van Gogh. It's a wood sculpture. And we looked at this work, my co-curator, Nancy Warner, and I, we looked at it, and we immediately recognized the history behind it and what we thought the artist was trying to do and what we thought he was trying to communicate, and we categorized it. And he just looked at us and said, not really. I'm not hiding that this is a sculpture, that it's made of wood. And we said, but it looks real. It looks like you can touch this and close the notebook book rings. It's trompe l'oeil. It's this. And so we're trying to categorize it. We're trying to classify it. And really the artist is saying, okay, sure, go ahead, but I'm just telling you, I'm really not trying to trick anyone into thinking this is really a book. So that was the general point.
And before we go to some other things about the center, and I was saying during the break, because the conversation continued about artists and message, that I'm not talking about messages that save the world, but that someone who is an artist, like Scott and Kevin, you see something and you see light or you see shape, something appeals to you, and you want me to see that. That might classify as what I mean by message, and I'm sure, isn't that part of what you're doing?
Well, I think some of the biggest mistake is in the beginning, is that the idea that the artist creates anything for anybody else to see. I mean, I think that
that's a good point.
That if this is something that they want to see, and they maybe want to put it out there because they like seeing it. I mean, from anything, even from the most, culturally viable thing that's out there. I think that there's this big bamboo thing on top of the Metropolitan Museum by the Starn Twins, which is and I know the reason they wanted to do this because they just wanted to see it. it's just got to be cool to do. And it's like, everyone can do whatever they want, but here's this weird bamboo structure on top, and this is cool, and look what we can do. Whoa. And it's like really cool to do. And there are other things that carry this heavy cultural import, but I think a lot of times there are places early on in art making, the formative artist will suddenly say, but what do you think? What, is this good? Is this something that people want to see? And I think an artist can stop sometime and let themselves be that infant a lot longer. And even if they're going to make things that are really about public message, it's still something that they can see in the world. They don't need verification from the outside world to say that it is art. Although the culture may make it art and may make it saleable and all that, I just think that
that's not why it's done.
I mean, it's an idea.
Kevin?
Yeah, I think that artists are people who, like citing that commercial from a few years ago, they see things visually, or they just deal with the world visually. They see something, and you see a sunset, and you want to draw that or paint that. You see something over here, and makes you think about, but wouldn't it be great if it looked like this? And a lot of it is just sort of putting things out there that you feel like we need to see. That's how we think about the world. We have to see it on paper. We have to see our hand afterwards. We've shaped it or reshaped it with our own hand. And sometimes you share it with people. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have a big message. Sometimes you have a smaller one.
Sometimes you just have a tomato soup can.
Yeah, or you don't even know what the message is until afterwards, until somebody else has looked at it and figured it out. Maybe you need a curator to sometimes do that.
And that's
really
really true, too. And that's literally that thing with the thing itself. I mean, there's Jasper Johns, King of Pop, did the beer cans. They just was because he thought it was an interesting idea. Like, nobody actually sat there and he had a beer, put it on a table, looked at it, and went, wow. And here's a piece that's very relevant still life that was in a very important show at MoMA some years ago that was like, look, still life still exists, and we bring all this new agenda of pop, and you were mentioning Andy Warhol, the same thing. We bring this stuff to it, but people are still looking at the things in themselves just as things, and everybody else piles stuff on top of it.
I want to thank you all for taking time today. I know, Scott, you're not in school today, but you are teaching, so the real world has begun for you. So
Indeed,
I thank you for taking some of the extra time and being here. And Kevin, it was good to meet you. And I encourage everybody to take a look at what's going on at the Pelham Arts Center.
Thank you so much, Nora.
It's always good to have you.